morning. Welcome to everyone watching online. I'm Brandon Fess with the Local History and Genealogy Division here at the Rochester Public Library. Today we're proud to present Researching Black History in London, Ontario, the Black Londoners Project. In 1856, Benjamin Drew, an American abolitionist, traveled to Canada to transcribe the oral stories of formerly enslaved black men and women. Among them were 16 individuals who settled in London, Ontario, one of whom was a former Rochester resident. Their narratives, recorded in Drew's book, A North Side View of Slavery, describe their former enslavers, their escapes, and how they made it to Canada. But what of their lives afterwards? With Drew's accounts as their starting point, Western University researchers Alyssa MacLean and Miranda Green-Barteet and their students are working to trace the paths these self-liberated individuals took after arriving in London and better understand their experiences in the area. By documenting these journeys through an interactive website hosted by Western libraries, MacLean and Miranda Green-Barteet aim to address a long-standing gap in the history of Black Londoners. Today we're proud to welcome Alyssa MacLean, who is an assistant professor in the Department of English and Writing Studies at Western University. Her research examines the literary relationship between Canada and the United States in historical and contemporary contexts. Along with Miranda Green-Barteet, she is working on the Black Londoners Project, which is funded by the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada. She's also working on a book project examining how 19th-century American authors developed ideas about U.S. citizenship, racial identity, and national belonging through the literary representations of Canada. Joining her is David Mitterauer, who is a sixth-year PhD candidate in English at Western University. He specializes in early American literature and early Black writing. His dissertation is on wonder and the phenomenology of mediation in Black autobiographies and fictions of the long 18th century. Ladies and gentlemen, the Black Londoners Project.
Okay. Great, well, thank you very much for that nice introduction. I'm just getting my laptop up here. Yes, I wanted to, my name is Alyssa MacLean, and I'm really pleased to be here. I wanted to begin by thanking our hosts, Brandon Fest and Christine Radarski, and the Rochester Public Library for the invitation to come and speak today. I actually grew up in Toronto, which is right across the lake, and I've never had a chance to visit Rochester before, so this is my first time, and it's David's first time too, so we're really excited to be here to share our research and hearing your questions. So my name is Alyssa, and I'm one of the co-PIs of the Black Londoners Project, along with Miranda Green-Barteet, who wasn't able to make it today. David is here to present with me, and we're coming from Western University, which is in London, Ontario. We have a slide here to show you where London is. In case you need a reminder, we're about halfway between Detroit and Toronto. As we begin our talk today, we want to acknowledge that Western University and the geographical area of London are located on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinanton nations, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. We would also like to thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for funding our research, and Western Libraries and Archives for all of their assistance with the archival research that we've been doing so far. Okay. So I'm going to start by situating our project in the context of Black Canadian historical studies. The Black Londoners Project is an open access digital humanities website that provides research on the lives of 16 Black Londoners from the mid-19th century. In 1854 and 1855, Benjamin Drew, who was a white abolitionist from Boston, traveled to Ontario to interview formerly enslaved African Americans about their experiences as refugees from US slavery. He transcribed their oral histories, and in 1856, he published A North Side View of Slavery, The Refugee, or the Narratives of Fugitive Slaves in Canada. And the book is organized into chapters, and each chapter focuses on a city in Ontario. There's 14 cities in total, so 14 chapters. And each chapter provides a collection of transcribed oral testimonies of Black persons who made their homes in that city. And this book is an important resource for Black Canadian studies because even though it was written and published by a white author, it provides us with a lot of details about the lives of Black people who lived in pre-Confederation Canada. And those details are otherwise pretty hard to come by. Drew's chapter on London includes 16 narratives dictated by Black freedom seekers who had left the United States and settled in London. And many of these individuals had once been enslaved in the US. As literary scholars, we were, of course, immediately interested in the stories as autobiographical texts, but what we realized is that surprisingly, there really wasn't a lot else known about what happened to these 16 Black Londoners. Only about 3 had been mentioned in public commemoration projects in London, and for some, there was nothing or almost nothing published about their lives. So we decided to try and find out what we could about them. Where had they come from in the US? What were their lives like in London? What happened to them after they spoke to Drew? In the interviews with Drew, some Black Londoners represent their lives in really positive terms. They describe their work history and their successful businesses or property that they owned. But others describe facing segregation and discrimination in London. Our project seeks to collect more information about each of these individuals and present this information on an open access website that links each individual narrative with maps, AV materials, and archival sources that are often really difficult to access, especially for communities that have been historically underrepresented or not really part of the university community. So we're here today to offer an overview of our project, to talk about the difficulties of completing research in Black life in 19th century Canada, and finally to present a case study on Francis and Margaret Henderson, who were 2 of the 16 Black Londoners that we're studying. And we decided to focus on the Hendersons because they lived in Rochester prior to coming to Canada. And the time they spent in Rochester has actually really informed how we understand their lives in London. But before we get into their case studies, I'd like to give you a sense of some of the challenges of studying Black transnational figures like the Hendersons, who sometimes aren't adequately framed in historical projects that are organized around national lines. So, it's worth noting that the way that Black history has been memorialized and studied in the US is different than the way that it's been memorialized in Canada. So let me just give you an example. So let's take Rochester as an example. Because of prominent Black figures like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, Rochester's Black history is very visible in some parts of the city. Many of you likely recognize this building here. It's the Tallman building. That was Douglass's office for the North Star and Jacobs's anti-slavery reading room. And this building still stands today as a spatial commemoration of Black history. The Hendersons, who we're studying, lived just down the street from there, beside what is today the Rochester DMV office on 134 East Main Street. But in contrast to the Tallman building, the original building in which the Hendersons lived, and out of which they operated some form of grocery business, doesn't exist anymore. So on one hand, we're really glad to see the public commemoration of Douglass and other Black figures in Rochester's cityscape. But by contrast, London has had a historical tendency to erase local Black history, either by overlooking Black presences in Canada or remembering Black Canadian history in a way that hides its unique characteristics. And unfortunately, this erasure is still ongoing, but I'm really hopeful right now. We're in a period of change in London's public commemoration and its history, and I'm thinking that things are kind of turning the corner. But there's still a lot of erasure happening. So for example, the heart of downtown London, like this part of Dundas Street, had a visible Black community in the mid-19th century, okay? And the current streetscape, so the building that existed is on the right side here. The current streetscape has obliterated that building, right? And you can't actually tell where the prior buildings were because there's a parking lot and, an arena in the way. The Canada Life Place, which is a concert hall and sports arena, now dominates this block. And when it was built, it replaced some 19th century buildings, and its new facade was built to imitate the facade of the 19th century houses and buildings that it was replacing. So if you notice the windows on the picture in the upper left corner, upper left-hand corner here, are supposed to imitate the row of windows of the center building in the older painting. So that facade is supposed to match. But it refers to these buildings without acknowledging who was in them. And on this block in the 1850s, there was a black-owned shoe repair business as well as a black barber shop, but those local black historical presences are erased from the contemporary landscape. Okay, so you can see here the squares are where the buildings are now, so the before and after. Okay. When London does remember Black history, it often does so in a way that supports Canadian nationalism. So, for example, in 2013, the Canadian government named a federal building in downtown London after Richard Pierpoint, who was a Black loyalist who gained his freedom after fighting for the British Empire in the Revolutionary War, and who later fought in the War of 1812. And the War of 1812 in Canada is taught as kind of a national war, like a war that kind of was defending Canada against the United States. I recognize that is not always the way that is taught in American history, but Canadians kind of look at it like that. So, so the fact that he fought in the War of 1812 is like a big deal. So when this building was built, the choice of the name was celebrated as a progressive move that celebrated Canada's Black history, and it does celebrate that history. But Pierpoint didn't have any ties to London specifically that we can see. As a result, the commemoration celebrates the emancipation of enslaved people and the inclusion of Black Canadians as part of the Canadian National Project, but paradoxically obscures Canada's own practices of enslavement and ignores the presence of the local Black history that was there. So on this site, there was a Black Londoner named Alfred T. Jones had an apothecary shop, and his brother, Abel B. Jones, ran a dry goods store down the street from here. And London's present-day Black community and its allies are trying to erase this or address this erasure of London's Black history, and our project is part of that attempt as well. Okay, so so these are some of the practices that we're seeing in the commemorative history of London itself, and I'm going to move now towards discussing London's Black history. So Europeans began settling the area that is now London in the late 18th century. The city was founded as a result of the London Township Treaty, which was a land purchase agreement between the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation and the British Crown for a tract of land. And the city was incorporated in 1840. Black presences actually predated the incorporation of London and continued throughout the 19th century. So the presence of Black individuals in the London area is long, and it precedes London's incorporation. By the early 1840s, there was a small Black population in London, many of whom were formerly enslaved individuals who had arrived in London via the Underground Railroad. At that point, London was primarily an agricultural community. That's still to some extent true. There's a lot of industries like food processing industries and that sort of thing. Kellogg had a plant, and there are other industries like that. Black migration to London increased sharply after the US government passed the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, and by the mid-1850s, that was the high point of Black migration in the 19th century in London, and there were about between 300 and 500 Black people living in London at that point. So for many enslaved African Americans, clandestine movement to Canada on the so-called Underground Railroad ensured some concrete legal protections and freedoms that were undoubtedly beneficial. But Canada has become really well known and even mythologized as a haven, an end of the Underground Railroad, and a place that had chosen to reject slavery through the 1834 Slavery Abolition Act at a time when the United States was becoming more dependent on slavery. For many Canadians, Canada's role in the Underground Railroad is a point of national pride. It's seen as a moment in history where Canada made a superior moral choice. However, the focus on Canada's role in the Underground Railroad often prevents an honest accounting of what Black life was like in Canada. For example, the Canadian public often forgets that slavery existed in Canada until 1834. Such distorted understandings of history have made it harder to identify and address forms of racism in Canada. And I also say that the myth of the Underground Railroad has emphasized Canada as a place where Black migration and Black agency kind of stops. Many American-based studies of the Underground Railroad end once formerly enslaved individuals make it to Canada, and many Canadian studies stop when Black people went to the United States. As a result, there's comparatively few historical projects that follow the more complicated journeys of Black freedom seekers in their entirety over their lifetime. So by tracking these migrations, we complicate the idea of the Underground Railroad as an exclusively northward trajectory. And what we're finding is that not all Black people embrace their new Canadian identity easily. And many of them made repeated migrations across the border. These migrations indicate that we need to rethink the Canada-US border as a zone that many Black people crossed and recrossed in a really complicated search for better conditions that sometimes lasted their entire lifetime. And this is true not just for London, but also many Black communities on the border, including Detroit, Windsor, Buffalo, St. Catharines, all of which had significant Black transnational populations. Secondly, because of this perception of Canada as a racial haven, Canadian institutions have not received the pressure or the funding, really, to examine and preserve Black Canadian history in the way that the Civil Rights Movement did in the United States. And so this has had the result of making Black Canadian archival projects harder because many institutions are often just unaware of their Black history holdings or have decided not to preserve them altogether. So this is why our project tries to fill in the blanks of Drew's narrative as much as possible. Our project focuses on 5 key research questions. So who were the 16 Black Londoners represented in Drew's book? What happened to them after Drew's book was published? What happened to them after slaves in the United States were emancipated? How accurately did Drew depict their lives, especially their experiences in London? Did they have connections to other Ontario communities? Did they maintain connections to family and friends in the United States? And finally, what do their stories teach us about life for Black people in 19th century Canada? By learning about their lives and presenting our research on an open access platform, we hope to complicate understandings of Black life in Canada in the 19th century. So the narratives that form the core of our literary materials were written during a period of historical and political turmoil. Drew wrote The Refugee in response to a book called A Southside View of Slavery, which was an 1854 book written by Reverend Nehemiah Adams of Boston. Adams was a pro-slavery advocate who argued that African Americans were, quote, happy to be slaves, end quote, and that enslavers were protecting and educating slaves. So Drew responded to Adams's claims by actually traveling to Canada and interviewing formerly enslaved people who had settled there and asking them whether they were happy as free persons in Canada. And so in 1856, he published The Refugee with the publisher John P. Jewett, who had published Uncle Tom's Cabin. Drew included accounts from Black men and women, and he represented individuals from different class positions and employment. In most cases, Drew offers a detailed account of their lives, but little is really known about them beyond what is published in The Refugee. Black Londoners appear sporadically in London newspapers in the latter half of the 19th century, but white journalists at that time often described the Black community in negative and blatantly racist ways. And it doesn't help that many of the formerly enslaved people who made their way to London had been prevented from learning how to read and write. And when they arrived in London, they had to learn that. So there isn't really a lot of Black authored literature that we can access as a resource. And aside from The Refugee, there's a major gap in Black Londoners' self-expression until the 1923 publication of The Dawn of Tomorrow, which is on the right side on the slide here. That was London's first black newspaper, and that was in publication until the 50s. So this lack of personal accounts by black Londoners in the 19th century results in a gap in our historical knowledge of black life in London. Okay, so what are some of the things we found out? You know, this project really brings together academics, community groups, historians, and students. London's black history has been examined before in both community and scholarly contexts, but what we're finding is that these efforts have either not gained the public recognition or permanence that we see in other cities like Chatham, Ontario, which has a Black History Museum, for example. One reason for this is that except for one site, which is the AME Chapel, this is a chapel in London that has recently been preserved. It was a chapel built by formerly enslaved people who had come to London, and that chapel is a real success story. It was recently preserved in the last, I think it opened 2 years ago, it was originally located in downtown London, had been moved around a lot, and it was in danger. It was dilapidated. It was in danger of being destroyed, and people moved it to Fanshawe Pioneer Village, which is a historical site outside of town, and now it's become part of their programming. And is much more available for people to see. So that's a really nice success story. But apart from that, and apart from a couple of churches downtown, I think the Beth Emmanuel Church is still intact, but London otherwise doesn't have a lot of historical architectural sites with which to celebrate and commemorate its black history. So, you know, historic sites like Museum London have provided briefer analyses of London's 19th century black community, but on the whole, the representation hasn't been very comprehensive. So our project tries to address this heritage gap by focusing on the stories of Drew's interviewees, examining aspects of their lives, like their community relationships that they're talking about, or labor history as seen through tax records and census information. And then, you know, we're also presenting visual evidence of past locations of black life alongside the erasures that have happened since. So one of the advantages of having a website is that you can kind of do a before and after look at, you know, how things have changed over time. And then, you know, part of the goal there is to point out how black history has been remembered or not remembered. Another obstacle is how information has been shared. So local community organizations, such as the London Black Heritage Council, have often played an important role in preserving records of black lives when university historians and public libraries did not. However, historically, such groups have been excluded from academic research on this topic, and meanwhile, scholars have engaged in their own examinations. So, you know, there was a mid-20th century work by a London historian and librarian named Fred Landon, who offered early examinations of London's role on the Underground Railroad. More recently, historians have provided oral histories of black neighborhoods in more contemporary contexts. They've examined the labor history of London's 19th century black community. They've published and editorialized correspondence of the first pastor of the AME Chapel, and they've also investigated examples of de facto practices of segregation in London's schools. But what we're finding is that these community and scholarly constituencies have not always been great at collaborating with each other. They've often been working in isolation. And so the lack of communication amongst those researching and recording London's black history results in, you know, problems like the duplication of research and limited community engagement and, you know, competition over limited resources that, you know, these are problems that are not unique to London, let's just say. But our project will address this by trying to work with community groups and family genealogists, students, and other academics to ensure that findings are shared so that each constituency can learn from the other and so that the widest possible audience has access to the findings. There's no paywall. So the fact that London's black history has been neglected in public memorialization and academic research suggests that the concerns about class, race, and national identity that are raised by these black Londoners continue to pose an obstacle to academic and popular understandings of Canadian heritage. Our research suggests that the lived experiences of these black Londoners complicate or even repudiate the idea of Canada as a so-called racial haven, right? While Drew certainly wanted to present a portrait of successful Black refugees in Canada, most of his London interviewees reveal racial tensions between Black Londoners and the white London establishment. Drew himself condemns what he called the prejudice of the whites for preventing Black children from attending London schools, which were integrated at the time, but there was efforts made to segregate them. One Black Londoner, A.B.B. Jones, complained about the de facto practices of racial segregation in London's churches, while Margaret Henderson wavers in her own commitment to her Canadian home, admitting, quote, "If Washington were a free country, I would like to go back there." And I don't think she was alone in feeling that way. I think a lot of Black Londoners who had come from the United States had come under duress, right? And when the Civil War ended, they were interested in going back to the United States to reunite with their families. So I think that's part of the reason why there were so many migrations in this time period. Our preliminary research also shows that the racism in London was a significant obstacle for Black Londoners. The London Free Press publicly shamed Black Londoners who opposed proposals to segregate London schools in the 1850s and 60s. Other scholars have shown that segregation and racism persisted in London throughout the 20th century. One noteworthy example is Ron W. Shaw's recent work examining the popular acceptance of Confederate quote-unquote refugees who moved to London after the Civil War in the States. So these families came from South Carolina and moved to London, and because they didn't feel comfortable in the United States after the Confederacy lost. And the fact that many of these Confederate families moved to London and then were immediately welcomed into London's elite only confirms these views of London's racial intolerance. And furthermore, Tracy Adams's examination of Black London's labor history suggests that working class Black Londoners from the 1860s to the 1880s often remained in the same positions that they had had in the 1850s, unlike white Londoners who often kind of moved up the class scale and were able to improve their own prospects when London was undergoing a period of industrialization. So there was a difference in how different workers were racialized and treated in the workplace. So our project's examination of the fates of these Black Londoners beyond their successful Underground Railroad escapes will thus illustrate some realities of Black Canadian life that will require some serious rethinking of Ontario's heritage, including the presence of socially sanctioned racism, or segregation, the creation of forms of systemic racism in London, and the pervasive quality of racism in southwestern Ontario. These realities, in turn, may explain why many of the Black Londoners of our study had a really complicated relationship to both London and Canadian identity, and most either disappear from London's historical record or return to the United States in the 1860s and 70s. Our project thus intersects with others in Black Canadian history and cultural studies that offer, quote, a scholarly intervention into the continual construction of Canada as a geographically and demographically white place by confirming and theorizing Blacknesses within the country's historical narratives, end quote. This project enables us to analyze the structural features of early Canadian life that affected the happiness and success of Black people in London. Okay. So the Black Londoners Project will be shared with the public through Story Maps, which is a program that combines interactive maps, multimedia content, and text. And you can see this is sort of what a story map, you can't see it very well right now, but this is what our story map is going to look like. So we're going to have interactive maps that are showing where they lived and worked, where their schools and churches were located, and what parts of the US they fled. We also use some of the historical findings and strategies employed by Michelle Hamilton's Here, Here, London project, including using voice actors and local Black community members to narrate sections of the 16 narratives of our study. By drawing from print cultural materials like photographs, when possible, we will acknowledge the important ways that Black Canadian identity was constructed through media that have often been perceived as insignificant or less trustworthy than archival or literary sources. And as we complete this work, we'll also keep Barrington Walker's question in mind, which was, how are we going to go about the process of systematically remembering the Black past, and what is the nature of the archives from which we can draw? Scholars like Walker and Jennifer Harris have theorized the fundamental kind of unknowability of 19th century Black lives. While our site hopes to provide accurate historical knowledge, we will also confront the problems that come from our representational choices. So I think that's sort of the overview of where we stand in Black Canadian studies and Black North American studies, and I'm going to invite David up here now to give you guys a case study on Rochester's family, the Henderson family.
Hi everyone. Thank you also from me for having us here. We're really excited to be presenting. I'm just going to pivot really quickly to a different slideshow, just so that I can show off what the story maps would look like, or how you can imagine that this website might turn out. So we have here the Francis Henderson story map that we've been working on. The story maps usually start with this the starting page. We weren't really sure how to best present this to you, so we opted for just taking screenshots for a slideshow. So the main functionality that I want to show off here, that we can just see a little bit, is that the story maps has basically a table of contents that allows you to navigate through different sections in each individual's life. And what I want to get to specifically, and we'll talk about the content here in just a moment, is the maps part of story maps that helps us to take maps and weave narratives into the progression of migrations, for example. So if we were to, for example, as here, look at the Hendersons' escape from Washington, D.C., then we could have a kind of scrolling sidecar, as they call it here, to talk about details of their escape, look at the next steps in their escape. We don't really know where they went immediately after getting out of Washington, and ultimately they end up in New York and Rochester, and that kind of allows us to zoom in onto the spot that we talked about earlier on 134 East Main Street, roughly in that address. And what is difficult to show off here, but take my word for it, the story maps itself has also has an interactive element to the map, so it allows users to zoom in, zoom out as they would like, and even click on certain points in the map to then bring up descriptions of, hey, here's the Tallman building, and this is where Frederick Douglass had his newspaper office. So that is one of the things that allow for a little bit of play and interactivity. Okay, so let's move on to the case study. All right. So one thing that I want to emphasize here real quick is that what we present here are not exclusively our findings, but that scholars have come before us and work alongside us. A specific shout out that I want to give here is to Dan J. Broiled and his book Boreal and Blacks, because that one alerted us initially to the textual traces of the Hendersons in Rochester. The Hendersons themselves say that they were in Rochester, but only with his book were we able to look at the archival traces there. So when we began research on the Hendersons, we started looking at their narratives. What you see here on the screen is Francis and Margaret Henderson's narratives in Drew, side by side. Francis Henderson's narrative is much longer than the screenshot shows here, of course. And we began to ask questions to see what do they reveal of themselves here, and what can we confirm, and how much as possible can we confirm in the historical record of these narratives. One thing that you can already see in the screenshot is that Margaret Henderson is only listed as Mrs. Frances Henderson. So even, archival work starts out with the basic questions of what is this person's first name? How can we start untangling her identity from Francis as her husband? None of this is necessarily surprising given how gender is often represented in archival resources, but it's these kind of things where we have our starting points. As for the narratives themselves, Francis's narrative is a little bit one of the longer ones in the London section, functions as a traditional slave narrative in many ways, that he talks about his upbringing, his attempts of practicing his faith against the wishes of his owners, the experience of violence at the hands of his owners, and ultimately the escape. Margaret, in turn, her narrative is much shorter and is much more focused on solely her escapes. So this is about her owners killing another slave, and that prompts her escape, even though contractually she would have been free and manumitted at the age of 30. From what they reveal about themselves, we don't know the names of their family or their owners. And there's also the possibility that we need to be aware of that Frances and Margaret, as well as the last name Henderson, might be names that they adopted in freedom. So all of that makes it difficult to judge or to find out more detailed sources on their lives in Washington. What Francis reveals about himself gives us roughly a date of birth of 1822, although the ages of the family members vary greatly across Canadian censuses, so that's partially a reflection that the family would have been rather uneducated, but also that they didn't know their age, but also didn't acquire the means necessarily to keep track of their age later in life. We don't know if the Hendersons, or if Frances and Margaret knew each other in DC, or whether they met on their escape or only in Rochester. So that is one thing that we are still grappling with. Francis says about himself that he escaped at the age of 19, and that is in 1841, according to him, with a group of enslaved men in the neighborhood. And then, from then on, both emerge in the historical record for the first time in 1849 in Rochester. So all around, these two narratives are rather typical accounts of antebellum accounts for the Underground Railroad. So there isn't a lot of detail about their escape. In fact, that Francis tells us that he stayed in Rochester for a while before coming to Canada is already a lot more than we get from other sources. So that is both a function of protecting the people who helped them escape, but also keeping routes of escape open for the refugees that come after them. And this is where we start filling in the gaps of the narratives as much as we can. There we are. So here we see a screenshot of the 1849 Daily American Directory of the City of Rochester. City directories were, helped readers find businesses, people, addresses, and also provided opportunities for advertising and for genealogists and historians. They also have crucial information on family, neighbors, associates, institutions in the city, important landmarks, these kind of things. And as Broiled already points out, the Hendersons appear in the city directory on 93 Main Street, where they are listed as having a business, a grocery business, and that this is their residence. Now, the Rochester City Directory here was segregated into white and quote-unquote colored sections, so from this we can tell that Francis Henderson was likely the only black grocer in town in those years, but it also shows that if we look at the address alone, that there are also white people who are listed at that address, which complicates what the grocery business really is. So it can be a store. It could also mean that Francis is primarily listed here because he sold produce from a cart in the street. Thanks to the invaluable help of Brandon Fess at Rochester Public Library, we know that 93 Main Street is 134 East Main Street, roughly, today, because we can correlate this older address with newer maps that have the contemporary street addresses. So what you see here is a very zoomed in image of Main Street on the right. That red bar on the side is where Main Street runs. If this is disorienting, that's because west and east run vertically here. So this is basically near the Rochester DMV office. What the city directory doesn't tell us is about Margaret. We only know that she is there as well from the 1850 US Census. That's on the table that you see on this slide here. And it's not just Frances and Margaret, but also their one-year-old son, Charles, who is with them. And we only recently became aware of the Hendersons' textual presence in Rochester. So there may be more traces that they left that we're currently unaware of, but that will be a matter of further research. So let's back up a few slides here. I showed you a list. I showed you this map is actually neat. I'm not gonna complain about that one. And I showed you census tables. So remember when we talked about multimedia and photographs? You can already guess that this is one of the main challenges of this project, because visual material of Black people in the 19th century and Black communities are fairly rare, at least in the archives that we can work from. So things like this here. We have two photographs on this slide. The one on the left shows a Black woman in her mid-20s. I think she is at that point, so that is Mahala Pryor. She and her family lived in a little bit north of London, and that's a photograph from the 1880s from the Archives and Special Collections at Western. And then on the right you have a photograph of two Black men in suits, kind of this typical like photography studio photograph of the 19th century. We don't know who they are, and this photograph is from Brock University. And findings like these are on the rare side, but they are really important because they humanize historical Black Canadians in ways that official documents cannot. So we're always balancing the need for, or the desire to have visuals and photographs with the fact that these photographs don't necessarily show the people that we are researching. So we're trying to bridge that gap by thinking about what these photographs tell us about the communities that the people that we are looking for live in. So another strategy for that is to look at spaces in cities or in the places that people lived to think about the communities some more. So for Rochester, the Rochester Public Library has photographs like these around the late 19th, early 20th century of Main Street, and these give us glimpses of what the neighborhood looks like, right? So in this photograph, for example, on the left side of the street, roughly in the middle of the picture, that's where their apartment would have been. So this gives us a little bit of an idea of what this looked like. And just because of the geographical approach that we are taking to this project, we already mentioned Frederick Douglass, so that the Hendersons lived near Douglass's newspaper office is really interesting and has a lot of implications for their own existence in the Rochester Black community, what values, ideas, social connections they made here, and then also carried to Canada, and how that informed their lives in Canada, which I'll get to in a moment. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over a couple of things here. So Francis himself says that he was broken up in Rochester, New York by the Fugitive Slave Bill. That's a quote. And as far as the Hendersons present themselves to us through their narratives and what we see in the archival sources is that this migration represents the second major uprooting of their lives. So that means that they are part of a larger exodus of formerly enslaved and free Black people from the northern US into Canada as a result of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The 1851 American Anti-Slavery Society report, that's the screenshot that you see on the bottom half of the screen, reported that all but 2 of the 114 congregants of the Black Baptist Church in Rochester escaped after the act was passed. And the Hendersons show up as Baptists in the Canadian census records. So it's likely that they would have been part of this group. So whether they escaped as a group or the family on their own, they would have crossed the border by boat from New York somewhere to southwestern Ontario. Niagara Falls is only one of the many crossing points, but we don't have any documentation about that because border crossings would usually go undocumented at that point. And then they reappear in Hamilton, Ontario. Yes, the tables are back. Did you miss them? And from the sources that I'm showing here, so the Hamilton census from 1851, the 1861 census for London, we can see that they moved between the 50s and the 60s, and the Provincial Freeman reports that Margaret gave birth to a daughter on June 3rd, 1854. The Provincial Freeman, of course, the most important black newspaper of 19th century Ontario and Canada. So since they appear in the London section here in Drew's narrative, we think that they must have moved before that point, since Drew was there in late 1854, so they must have been there to be interviewed there. Why they moved to London, we don't know. Hamilton itself had a vibrant black community, so they could have made connections to London there or saw some opportunity that that gave an incentive to move there. Now let's look on London itself. The area that you see on the map here is a little bit south of historical downtown London. It's in blue. This is difficult to see here. But if you see 3 different points on the map, the African Methodist Episcopal Church on the far left, the Second Baptist Church, that's the Black Baptist Church in town, roughly in the middle of the screen, and then the Hill Street Baptist Church, which didn't come into being before 1919. And this is an area called Soho, that's south of Horton, and this is largely an industrial working class neighborhood and primarily the location for where black people settled in London. So when we speak of de facto segregation, one thing that you can see on this map is that the northern end of Soho ends at the railroad. So the railroad itself is kind of this divider between the main downtown London life and the black community. What that means for the Hendersons is they largely had working class lives and performed manual labor, and that they likely took in work from white Londoners from downtown and performed that work at home. So there's a certain social downwards mobility connected to their move away from Rochester and the grocery business that they had, which speaks to the myths of the Underground Railroad that Alyssa was talking about a moment ago. That the Hendersons' case speaks to this lack of opportunity in a racist society that relegates black people to an underclass. So to finish up what we're trying to say here, so because Soho is an industrial area and home to the black community, it was mostly ignored by 19th century and 20th century photographers, so there isn't a lot of visual evidence of the black community. So we go to other sources. I'm going to spare you another table and look at kind of these 3 separate places where they lived in, just from the sources that we know and that we looked at. And this geographical approach shows us that these addresses are all in the same neighborhood as the Baptist Church, the Black Baptist Church on 260 Horton Street, which shows the importance of the Black Baptist Church for not only the Hendersons, but also access to community. So later in life, after Francis Henderson passes away, Margaret would live right beside the Black Baptist Church. So that's what you see on this screenshot here from a city directory. So she is right beside the Second Baptist Church. And there she would open a dry goods or confectionery store. The designation changes depending on what source you're looking at. So that, in combination with her hosting Samuel H. Davis, a Black Baptist minister from Buffalo, who also lived in Canada for a while, or I think the rest of his life, is all that points to the involvement and proximity of Margaret to the London's Black Baptist Church and cross-border networks, right? So the store, on the one hand, implies a change of fortune and an embeddedness in the community. And on the other hand, then we see that she's drawing on the grocery business experience that she made in Rochester to help the black community along. So to sum up what we've been talking about here, on a local level, this research gives us a better understanding of Black community structure because we can see that the community mostly grouped around churches as places of communal support. While we see in the Hendersons an upwardly mobile trend in Rochester, the migration tells us that London suggests a downward mobility for the first decades, at least, that they got here. And their lives are, in turn, also a story of a cross-border context. So Margaret's life suggests Black spirituality is also involved in forming a supportive community, maintaining connections to other Black communities in Canada and the US. And with all of that in mind, we want to recognize that even though we frame Margaret Henderson as a Black Londoner, she identified with multiple places and Black communities within and beyond Canada's borders. So all of this means that we recognize the layers of social connections that emerge geographically, which helps us challenge myths of Canada as a racial haven, which helps us address mainstream public memory, and it is one of the ways that we want to participate in forming a counter-narrative that centers the complex transnational nature of Black Canadian history. So, thank you.